Think you'd thrive in medieval England? Let me paint a picture. You wake up in 1325 on a bed stuffed with straw, alongside fleas, lice, and the faint stench of unwashed linen embedded in your only set of clothes. The moment you step outside, your morning bathroom ritual involves sharing a latrine with your neighbours, or worse, heading to an open sewer in the street. By now you'd be wondering, how much worse can this get? Spoiler, much worse. Stick around, because your medieval morning is just getting started. Imagine waking up itchy, not because of a bad dream, but because your bed is alive, and not in the metaphorical sense. Underneath you, your mattress, if you can even call it that, is a buzzing, wriggling, scuttling world of its own. You see, in medieval England, beds weren't built for comfort. They were pits of straw, sometimes mixed with rags, animal hair, or just whatever soft material people could scrounge up. Soft being a generous term here. This wasn't some neatly packed fluffy hay either. It was a loose, scratchy bundle thrown together, with little concern for what might already be living inside it. By the time you laid down, you weren't alone, and that's when the fun really started. It didn't matter if you were a farmer or a noble. Your bed didn't discriminate against fleas, lice, or bedbugs. They thrived in the crumbly straw and found endless hiding places among the folds of fabric or animal hair. These weren't the occasional nuisances we think of today either. Infestations were part of life, so much so that scratching was practically a reflex. And if you thought royalty fared better, think again. While the richest among society might have swapped out straw for expensive feather-down bedding, feathers weren't exactly insect repellent either. Nobles scratched just like everyone else, only maybe they'd do it in a slightly nicer nightgown. Tonight, you might toss and turn because you haven't adjusted the room temperature, or your pillow is a little too firm. Well, in medieval England, restful sleep was best described as fleeting. Each night was a battle between you and 100 silent attackers, not just crawling over you, but biting, burrowing, and spreading. Bedbugs left trails of itchy welts, lice crawled freely over your head and body, and fleas weren't satisfied with just a single bite. And here's the kicker, nobody really bothered doing much about it. Straw bedding wasn't replaced until the smell became unbearable, or until it literally started rotting. Sure, straw is cheap and plentiful, but let's be clear, it wasn't meant to last. Over time, sweaty bodies, spilled food, and whatever pets or livestock occasionally wandered into the house added to the mess. The straw would break down into a fine, dusty powder, providing warmth in the winter, but also clogging the air with filth. This powder was like an open invitation for even more pests to move in. Homeowners might try airing their straw out in the sun to refresh it, but this was more of a symbolic gesture than anything. It didn't kill the bugs. It just gave them a little sunlight before heading back inside, with you. Compare that to today, where your biggest bed-related complaints might involve the thread count of your sheets, or whether memory foam really makes a difference. Your clean, bug-free mattress probably feels like a miracle right now, doesn't it? If you're lucky, you might even wash your sheets every week or two, and enjoy the incomparable luxury of crawling into a fresh bed. This was completely unimaginable to medieval folks. The idea of simple comforts, like clean fabrics or a surface freshly scrubbed of dirt, was so foreign that complaining about lice and fleas would have sounded ridiculous. They were as normal as the weather, but beyond the annoyance or mild discomfort of a few bites, there was a far darker side to this nightly terrarium. These pests weren't just unwelcome houseguests, they were disease carriers, perfectly equipped to make your already challenging existence even worse. A single flea could bring bubonic plague into your home, and lice spread typhus like wildfire. One study estimates that lice contributed significantly to deadly outbreaks throughout medieval Europe, and if you think you could avoid them by taking precautions, there weren't any. Pesticides, bug sprays, or even a meaningful way to bathe didn't exist. Let's really think about that for a second. Your day starts not with a peaceful, light stretch, but with itching. Sitting up from your straw heap might send a few bugs scuttling from the folds of your blanket, and if scratching doesn't wake you fully, the unpleasant whiff of your bedding probably will. Now try telling yourself, "I slept well," as you pick nits from your hair. Or worse, imagine dragging yourself awake only to look down and see that faint, telltale red rash of bites creeping up your leg. Congratulations, you've just survived another medieval night. But your morning is off to a predictably miserable start. And here's the thing, getting up doesn't really help you escape. The discomfort follows you wherever you go, because fleas didn't just stick to the beds. They loved cozying up on your clothes too. And as long as you lived near other humans and animals, you weren't avoiding them. It's no wonder people would sometimes head straight to work without bothering to brush off the straw mat from the night before. After all, where else were they going to lay their head that night? There was no alternative, and replacing the straw pile wouldn't even guarantee any relief. You might think to yourself, well, at least I could fumigate or clean in some way. Surely someone in medieval England must have tried something. And you'd be half right. Some households turned to herbs or pungent flowers, hoping that their strong odours would scare the pests off. Popular choices included lavender, rosemary and mint, which were scattered among the straw or hung by the bed. And while these might temporarily mask the other smells of rot, sweat, and general medieval existence, they didn't exactly fix the problem. Bugs didn't seem to mind the fresh scent of lavender much, because without sanitation, they weren't going anywhere. There's something darkly amusing about imagining the medieval idea of cleanliness. A family crawling with lice, tearing at flea bites, convinced that tossing a few aromatic twigs into the straw pile had solved the issue. Meanwhile, the actual cause of all their itching continues to multiply beneath them. And this wasn't just limited to the poorest members of society. Almost everyone's bedroom situation was equally bad. You might say medieval people had extraordinary powers of endurance, not just because of how they worked or what they ate, but because they had to wake up every single morning and accept this as normal. For us, waking up nowadays means putting your feet on the soft carpet, maybe grabbing a cup of coffee, and starting a relatively clean, pest-free morning. For you back then, just standing up meant preparing to repeat the cycle of discomfort, scratching new bites, shaking out loose straw, and trying not to think too hard about the crawling sensations left over from the night. But the irony of the situation, stepping away from your parasite-ridden bed didn't mean your day would get better. In some ways, it only marked the beginning of your real problems. You weren't just waking up in discomfort, you were likely waking up sick. Flea bites could fester into infections, while lice spread itchy red welts that cracked and ooze. And without regular washing, or medicine of any kind, these small annoyances could turn serious faster than you'd expect. So, yes. Welcome to your medieval morning routine. Waking up wasn't relaxing or energizing. It was itchy, painful, and, if you were unlucky enough to catch something, possibly fatal. You can appreciate your memory foam mattress and freshly laundered bedding a little more today, right? Every second spent under your crisp, bug-free sheets feels like a modern miracle when you imagine the alternative. And yet, medieval life didn't stop just because you stumbled out of your strawy hellhole. In fact, it's only about to get worse as we move from beds to what comes next, the shared latrine. What's that? You thought the itching would be the low point of your day. Oh, not even close. Picture this. First thing in the morning, you shuffle out of bed, still scratching from that army of bedbugs you've spent the night battling. Your first thought? You need to take care of business. But in medieval England, that business wasn't something you could handle in the privacy of your own bathroom. Forget modern conveniences like a flushing toilet, quiet time alone, or soft toilet paper. You don't even get a door to shut. Instead, you reach for a chamber pot, the closest thing to a portable toilet, and prepare to share this deeply personal moment with everyone in your home, and eventually, your neighbors. Let's start with the chamber pot, because, let's be honest, that's the best it got, unless you were part of the royal family. This little bucket of misery was a household staple, sitting in corners or under beds, ready for action, day or night. And when it filled up, it was your job, or maybe, if you were lucky, the job of a servant, to dump its contents. But not into some organized waste system, or even a hole in the ground. Oh no. More often than not, the pot was emptied directly into the street. People would yell, "Gardiloo," a warning that loosely translates to, "Watch out below," before tossing everything out a window. Now imagine walking down a narrow medieval street, dodging splashes that definitely aren't rain, and you start to get the full sensory experience. Of course, this wasn't the fate of just chamber pot users. In medieval towns, sewage systems were often nothing more than shallow ditches running through the streets. These open sewers carried everything you can imagine, and probably a few things you can't, through the middle of town. Human waste, animal droppings, rotten food, heaven knows what else, all mixing together into fetid streams underfoot. The smell was biblical, the kind of thick, oppressive odor that you couldn't just walk past. It followed you, clinging to the air and your clothes. If you've ever driven past a landfill on a hot day, multiply that by 100, and you might be somewhere close to what medieval towns smelled like on a daily basis. Now, if you were slightly more fortunate, you might live near a public latrine. Maybe you're picturing some kind of rustic outhouse, isolated in a peaceful meadow, at least 10 paces from civilization. Forget it. These were communal outhouses crammed into busy areas, usually near marketplaces or riverbanks. Your morning trip meant sitting shoulder to shoulder with strangers, everyone awkwardly avoiding eye contact, while the smallest shred of dignity slipped away. And privacy? Not a chance. There were no stalls or barriers, just long wooden benches with cut-out holes arranged in a single row, all suspended over a pit that held, well, everything. If you were in a town with a slightly better setup, your waste might drain into a nearby river, but that didn't exactly solve the problem. Rivers were also a main source of drinking water, riddled with the same pollution you were trying to flush away. Ventilation wasn't even an afterthought in these latrines. The stench clung to the damp wooden walls, the floor, your clothing, and reached places you didn't know smells could reach. And when those pits finally filled up, well, someone had to be brave or desperate enough to dig them out. Sometimes waste was taken away in carts, though probably at the slowest speed possible because, let's face it, no one wants a waste removal mishap in the middle of town. Unfortunately, those carts didn't always make it far. More often than not, the waste was just dumped in a nearby ditch, woodland, or onto uncultivated land, where it festered in the open air until nature broke it down, or didn't. The countryside wasn't much better. Peasants, living in rough wooden huts, rarely had space or resources for proper bathrooms. A makeshift latrine might be dug out somewhere behind the house, or a bucket might serve as the primary option for the whole family. Now picture that bucket being used non-stop by several people, and tell me that doesn't make your skin crawl. Even worse, these outdoor latrines were often left uncovered because, frankly, nobody bothered with things like hygiene or sanitation. That open bucket meant flies, rats, and disease creeping in, as if they'd been personally invited. And if it rained, well, you can probably imagine the mess that created. This unspeakable filth spilled into every corner of medieval life. Shoes were more of a suggestion than a constant, and stepping outside in the wrong spot after a chamber pot had been flung out meant bringing the street's entire microbial ecosystem back into your home. Even castles, supposedly the height of medieval luxury, didn't have it figured out. They relied on garderobes, which were essentially holes in stone walls. That emptied right onto the ground or, if you were lucky, into a moat. Try not to think about that the next time you hear someone waxing poetic about fairy tale castles. They were not exactly architecturally odorless. In fact, attackers during sieges were known to climb through these waste chutes because medieval defences didn't account for the possibility of someone willing to crawl through literal human filth to get inside. But here's the thing. What passed for normal back then wasn't just gross, it was dangerous. Those shallow sewers and careless disposal systems turned medieval towns into disease factories. Rats, carrying fleas infected with the plague, thrived in the waste-choked streets. Flies swarmed the public latrines, spreading bacteria from one surface to another. And all of this mixed together in the water supply. People didn't understand germ theory back then, so washing their hands, or even thinking twice about the water they drank, just wasn't standard practice. It's no wonder illnesses erupted constantly, spreading from home to home with terrifying speed. Typhoid, dysentery, cholera, these weren't rare outbreaks. They were regular visitors, claiming countless lives. Even the methods used to clean weren't much better. Toilet paper hadn't been invented yet, so wiping was a creativity test that few passed well. Straw, moss, leaves, rags, anything vaguely absorbent became fair game. For those on the wealthier end, some fortunate souls used scraps of wool, but none of that was reusable unless you wanted to invite infection into the mix. So these materials were usually discarded right alongside everything else. And if you were rushed or just unlucky, you might end up wiping with a handful of leaves that weren't quite as friendly as they seemed. Let's just say poison ivy probably didn't kill people, but it sure made them miserable. For many, this daily humiliation became background noise. It was just how things were. You lived with the smell, the mess, the sickness it all caused, because there was no other option. The idea of private restrooms wouldn't even exist for centuries. And yet, thinking about the sheer discomfort of it, the smells, the lack of privacy, the constant risk of disease, makes even the grimiest modern public restroom seem like a 5-star spa. Now picture yourself in that moment, crouched over a wooden bench in some drafty, rank-smelling outhouse, or poised with a bucket in one hand, ready to fling its contents into the street. There's no relief in the act, only more to endure. The endless cycle of filth, the shame of activity made public, the knowledge that this is just life and nobody around you has it any better. Not really. Somehow, breakfast is still ahead though, probably waiting for you down in the same crowded street you just soiled. Getting clean after an experience like this feels almost impossible, especially when water itself is the next part of our problem. So don't even think about washing up too carefully, because staying dirty might actually be safer. Water was everywhere in medieval England, streams winding through towns, rivers separating villages, rain falling from the heavens. But here's the kicker. None of it was safe. What looked clean to the naked eye was more like a medieval cocktail of bacteria, waste, and decay, just waiting to ruin your day or your life. A stream, for example, might seem like a refreshing place to grab a sip, but what you didn't see were the chamber pots emptied upstream or the carcass of some unfortunate animal bobbing along, decomposing just out of sight. If you were lucky, you might get away with a nasty stomachache. If you weren't, well, congratulations. The water just handed you dysentery, typhoid, or any number of misery-inducing illnesses to deal with. It didn't take long for people to figure out that water wasn't exactly their friend. But instead of addressing the root problem, like, say, not dumping every foul thing into the nearest stream, they worked around it in some pretty questionable ways. Bathing fell out of fashion fast, not because they knew it was unhygienic, but because people actually thought it was too clean. Yes, too clean. The prevailing belief at the time was that bathing opened up your pores, and open pores were practically an open invitation for disease to waltz right in. So, the solution? Close those pores by staying dirty. The logic might sound absurd now, but back then, it genuinely made sense to people. After all, better to carry a layer of protective grime than risk letting the plague seep into your body through freshly scrubbed skin. This line of thinking wasn't exclusive to peasants either. Everyone bought into it, from farmers to kings. And when I say they avoided bathing, I mean they really avoided it. Forget your morning shower or even a weekly wash. People went for months or years without so much as a full-body rinse. The idea of plunging into a tub of water was seen as a potentially deadly indulgence, one most people weren't willing to risk. Even washing your hands or face wasn't common practice, especially during the colder months. A little splash of water here and there if necessary, but no one was scrubbing or lathering themselves up with soap. Soap, by the way, did exist, but it was made from things like animal fat and ash. Using it wasn't a refreshing experience. It was more like rubbing a greasy, gritty muck onto yourself and hoping for the best. So what happened when all that skipping out on baths started to, let's say, make itself known? Well, the smell was just part of life. If everyone stank, then no one really noticed. Or at least that's what they told themselves. Body odor wasn't a personal problem. It was a community experience. But even in the Middle Ages, there were limits to how much stink people could tolerate, which is where herbs and perfumes came in. These were the medieval version of deodorant, although they didn't exactly mask the problem. People stuffed lavender, rosemary, or mint into their clothes or carried small pouches of herbs to sniff so they didn't faint from their own stench. The wealthy took things a step further, dabbing themselves with rosewater or wearing costly perfumes to keep a vague aura of freshness. Of course, these solutions only papered over the problem. Underneath it all, the smell of sweat, dirt, and who knows what else clung like a second skin. Now imagine how this approach to cleanliness, or lack thereof, bled into other parts of life, like food preparation. Someone, unwashed for months, rolling dough for your bread, or gutting meat for your stew, it's enough to make your stomach turn. Remember, there were no gloves or sanitary kitchen practices to speak of. That layer of helpful or harmful grime they wore proudly didn't just hang out on their skin, it transferred to everything they touched. And the water they'd use in cooking, probably hauled from that same contaminated stream or a stagnant well. Because guess what? Boiling water wasn't always standard either. For many, food wasn't just a meal, it was a gamble. But back to the water situation, because it wasn't just streams and wells causing chaos. Even rainwater, which you'd think would be the cleanest option, quickly became a health hazard. Picture this. You set out a barrel to catch rain, thinking you've solved all your problems. But then birds start using the barrel as a toilet. Insects begin breeding in the stagnant water, and moss starts growing along the sides. By the time you take a sip, that pure rain has turned into a microbial soup. This was medieval England's version of filtered water, and it was just as dangerous as the stuff in the rivers. So what did people drink if water was such a health risk? Beer. Yes, beer, even for kids. Brewing beer required boiling water, which killed off most of the dangerous pathogens, turning it into one of the safer options available. And before you picture everyone stumbling around drunk 24/7, medieval beer was much lower in alcohol content than what we're used to today. It was enough to hydrate, but not enough to leave you staggering through the woods. Well, unless you overdid it, which certainly happened. But truthfully, beer wasn't just a drink, it was a necessity, the medieval equivalent of bottled water. But while beer offered a workaround, the lack of bathing wasn't something you could easily fix, even if you wanted to. Communal bathhouses did exist for a while, serving as the closest thing medieval people had to a spa day, but they weren't exactly bastions of cleanliness. In theory, these public baths could have helped with hygiene. In reality, they gained reputations for being places where gossip ran wild, and often so did extracurricular activities. It didn't take long for the church to crack down, arguing that bathhouses were dens of immorality. By the time many of them closed, even the small window of opportunity for a decent scrub was lost. Living without regular bathing wasn't just disgusting, it was dangerous. Diseases thrived in the dirt and sweat that caked onto people's skin. Lice, fleas, and other pests found perfect homes in unwashed hair and clothing, jumping easily from one person to the next. Clothes, by the way, weren't washed often either, if at all. Most people owned just 1 or 2 sets of clothes which they wore every single day until the fabrics practically fell apart. Even then, they were often patched up and worn a little longer. Washing fabrics in water that was already filthy seemed counterproductive anyway, so they carried on, accepting the ever-present grime as part of life. And here's something to keep in mind. All of this, the dirt, the smell, the pest infestations crawling up people's arms, was considered normal. There wasn't some medieval person walking around screaming, "Why do we live like this?" Because they didn't know any different. To them, staying clean wasn't worth the risk of disease, and as long as everyone was equally dirty, there wasn't much to complain about. It's wild to think about though, isn't it? Modern standards of hygiene, scrubbing hands with soap, washing faces daily, stepping into a warm shower without a second thought. None of that existed. Even something as small as washing your hands after touching raw meat would have been unheard of. But here you are, awake and alive in medieval England, carrying the weight of layers of filth you couldn't escape, no matter how hard you tried. Maybe you've masked your odor with a sprig of lavender. Maybe you've just decided to embrace it because everyone else does. Either way, skipping that morning bath doesn't mean you get to skip the rest of the day. There's still breakfast to deal with, or, to be more accurate, survival stew. What's that, you ask? Well, after your morning fights with water and dirt, it's time to see how many rotten ingredients you can stomach in one sitting. And no, you won't be washing your hands before digging in. Let's start with breakfast. A simple, comforting moment to fuel your day, right? Not in medieval England. Breakfast wasn't just a routine part of your morning. It felt more like a grim necessity, a matter of survival rather than enjoyment. Forget the variety of cereals, eggs, or fresh fruit we complain about running out of today. Instead, get ready for your daily serving of pottage. What is pottage, you ask? Well, it's not quite soup, and not really a stew. It's more of a thick, gloopy concoction made with leftover scraps of whatever was lying around. Barley, beans, turnips, and maybe a sad-looking onion if you were lucky. Think of it like a medieval mystery meal. Every spoonful could hold a slightly different flavor profile, which is to say, bland, followed by bland, with a sprinkle of despair. Pottage wasn't exciting, but it had one thing going for it. It could cook all day, even all week. Families would keep the pot going on a low simmer, tossing in new ingredients as they became available, no matter how old or questionable they were. By day 5, you weren't eating dinner so much as you were negotiating it, and that's likely what you'd start your morning with. A ladle of lukewarm pottage scraped from the cauldron on your hearth, served with a slice of dense, rock-hard bread. Don't get excited. It's not the fluffy, golden-crusted bread you're imagining. Medieval bread, made from rye or barley flour, came with a texture only slightly softer than tree bark. In bad years, when grain was scarce, peasants would bulk up the dough with whatever they could find. This included sawdust, clay, or ground up acorns, things that don't belong anywhere near food, but somehow made it in anyway. It kept the bread coming, barely, but eating it felt like chewing through misery. Now you might think, at least bread is filling. Sure, if you could manage it. Breaking off a piece could be a workout, and it wasn't uncommon to soak it in your pottage, just to soften it enough to avoid breaking your teeth. The bread had to be tough, because it was designed to last for weeks. Fresh bread wasn't a daily luxury like today. It was more like rationing an edible chunk of stone for as long as possible. And if you weren't careful, it might come with a bonus surprise, like ergot, a fungus that loved to contaminate rye. Eating bread contaminated with ergot wasn't just bad, it was downright dangerous. It caused convulsions, hallucinations, and in some cases, even death. Imagine starting your morning with bread that acted like both LSD and food poisoning, and you'll get the idea. So, what did you wash all this down with? Not water, never water. Water from streams or wells might look harmless, but the reality was far worse. It carried diseases like typhoid, dysentery, and cholera, courtesy of the raw sewage, animal waste, and rotting bodies frequently dumped into it. Drinking water wasn't just unpleasant, it was a gamble with your life. The solution: weak beer. Yes. At 6 in the morning, kids and adults alike sat down not with orange juice, but with ale. It wasn't the kind of beer that would knock you off your feet. This was weak, low alcohol stuff. But it was safe to drink compared to the horrors lurking in the water. It's wild to imagine, isn't it? Starting your day with a bowl of mush and a pint of what was basically medieval tap water with bubbles. If you're wondering about variety, don't bother. For the average person, pottage and bread were your staples, morning, noon, and night. Meat and cheese, rare luxuries. These were reserved for Sundays, feast days, or moments when your Lord decided to be unusually generous. And even then, it wasn't a guaranteed thing. Having meat for breakfast wasn't just extravagant, it was unthinkable. Instead, your best bet for something extra might be gnawing on a dried fish, or, if things were really grim, chewing through a piece of boot leather. Okay, maybe not literally, but you get the point. Protein was scarce, and fat, forget about it. Fresh fruits and vegetables added another challenge. They weren't available year-round, and when they were, they often went straight into fermenting for alcohol. Turnips, though, were the great equalizer. They were always in season, the foundation of every stew or pottage, and universally regarded as nothing short of awful. Onions weren't far behind, adding a rare bit of flavour to an otherwise bland diet, though not enough to make the food enjoyable. And when we talk about flavour, let's just say medieval cooking didn't involve a lot of seasoning. Spices like pepper or cinnamon were absurdly expensive, worth more than their weight in gold. Salt was a prized commodity too, so most meals were doomed to taste like wet burlap with a garnish of sadness. Food preservation, or lack of it, only, made things worse. Forget refrigeration. Meat barely lasted a day before becoming unrecognizable. The best preservation method involved salting it within an inch of its life, drying it out, or submerging it in some vile brine that didn't do much other than prolong the inevitable. Even then, you risked flies laying eggs all over it. Imagine carving into your special occasion slab of dried meat and finding it already occupied by maggots. Bread hardened into something resembling ceramic. Dairy products soured within hours. And fish, if not eaten immediately, gave off a smell that offended even medieval standards. But people ate it. Frankly, it was either that or chew your boot leather, as one source puts it. And as for food safety, well, that wasn't a thing. A lot of pottage ingredients were leaves, roots, or fungi that people didn't fully understand. Some might sit in a stew pot for days, soaking until they lost whatever slight nutritional value they had. Others brought their own dangers, like molds or toxins that weren't obvious until someone turned blue and died at the table. The diet was monotonous, and the lack of variety didn't just crush souls, it crushed bodies. Malnutrition was rampant, Without enough protein, fats, or critical vitamins, people were constantly tired, slower to heal, and more vulnerable to disease. Now picture yourself with a spoon in hand, staring into a bowl of greyish mush while gnawing on a shard of bread harder than your teeth. Your next sip of weak ale doesn't refresh you. It just reminds you how few options you have. This is how most of medieval England started their day, by settling, not enjoying. Breakfast wasn't about choice or flavour, it was about survival, and even then, it sometimes failed. Every meal posed its own risks, from spoiled ingredients to the long-term effects of poor nutrition. But you ate anyway because the alternative, starving, was worse. By the time you're done, you feel something close to full, but not really satisfied. Energy levels would spike briefly, but tired, underfed bodies rarely had much reserve. The idea of comfort food was basically non-existent. You got up from your wooden stool, brushed the crumbs off your tattered tunic, and geared up for the next part of your morning. Of course, you wouldn't be changing into anything fresh or clean. That single tunic you've been wearing for months wasn't just an outfit. It was practically glued to your body by now. And yes, that's what we're about to talk about. Your medieval wardrobe, full of rough fabrics and discomfort. Don't expect anything soft, or anything that smells less like a barn. Whatever horrors breakfast held, your clothing would be sure to match them. Just another day in medieval England. Getting dressed in medieval England wasn't about expressing your personal style or keeping up with the trends. It was purely about utility. Your clothes needed to cover you, protect you from the elements, and last for as long as possible. Comfort wasn't even part of the equation. Your wardrobe consisted of exactly one outfit. One. It was probably made from rough wool or linen, and you wore it every single day, no matter the weather, no matter the activity. Wool might sound cozy, but this wasn't your modern, soft-knit wool sweater. This wool was coarse, scratchy, and had all the breathability of a plastic bag. Linen was slightly better, at least in terms of texture, but it was still stiff and prone to trapping odours. Not ideal when you rarely washed either yourself or your clothes. Comfort was an afterthought, and durability was king. So here you are, waking up itchy and groggy, heading over to that same tunic you've been wearing for months. It's stiff, stained, and probably smells like damp straw and a compost pile that's been left out too long. You pull it on, knowing full well it's crawling with unseen irritants. Washing clothes was such an ordeal that it wasn't a weekly task, or even a monthly one. You needed to lug heavy buckets of water, heat it over a fire, and scrub the fabric using ashes or whatever soap-like substances you could make or barter for. It was hard work, and most people couldn't afford the time or resources to do it regularly. Instead, they'd let their clothes marinate in layers of sweat, dirt, and grime until washing became absolutely necessary. Which, let's be honest, usually meant only when they were falling apart. There weren't many layers to your outfit. Undergarments were optional at best. If you were lucky, you might have a linen undertunic to wear beneath the outer wool one. That extra layer helped protect your skin from the constant friction and itchiness of rough wool. But let's be real. Most people went commando. Picture that for a moment. Bare skin, scratchy fabric, and unwashed sweat mixing together on a hot summer day. Now, imagine it in winter, when that sweat froze into icy patches on your clothes because layers didn't exactly trap heat efficiently. Your clothes weren't just something you wore. They were a permanent part of you, almost like a second skin that only came off when absolutely necessary. And when they did come off, it wasn't pretty. Months of build-up meant that layers of oil, dirt, and dead skin clung to the inside. Every time you stripped down, you were greeted with a reminder of just how little medieval life prioritized hygiene. It wasn't just dirt and body odor that made getting dressed miserable. That one outfit you owned was attracting company, specifically lice, and fleas. And they weren't just passing through. Your wool tunic might as well have been an all-inclusive resort for parasites. Everyone has them. Nobles, lousy monks, itchy children, walk-in insect farms. No one escapes. That's right. Even the wealthiest households weren't free from infestations. Fancy clothing made from softer fabrics or lined with fur offered no protection. Lice didn't discriminate. And these weren't just a minor annoyance. Flea bites resulted in raw, red patches of skin. Lice left you scratching constantly, day and night, and they could also carry diseases that spread quickly among medieval communities. And if you were thinking about removing them, good luck. Without modern insecticides or even consistent laundry practices, you were fighting a losing battle. Changing outfits wasn't an option either. Laundry day wasn't just rare, it was a full ordeal. With no soap as we know it, and certainly no washing machines, cleaning clothes meant hours of back-breaking labour. Water had to be hauled from a well or stream, and then heated over a fire for scrubbing. Even after all that effort, the end result wasn't a fresh, clean tunic. It was just slightly less filthy. And after months of wear, fabrics stiffened from grime until they were almost unrecognizable. Your clothes weren't items of convenience. They were burdens you carried with you every step of the way. But it wasn't just the clothes themselves that caused problems. The lack of clean garments, paired with medieval hygiene, or the lack thereof, quickly turned your skin against you. Remember that wool tunic grinding against your bare skin? It wouldn't take long before the friction created raw, irritated patches. Fungal infections were common from the constant dampness and lack of fresh air under those layers. People also suffered from rashes and conditions like scabies, which turned your skin into a patchwork of itchy red streaks. Access to medical care was non-existent for most, so if you developed a rash, well, there's no dermatologist, no hydrocortisone, no one to tell you it's probably scabies. You just had to live with it. Footwear didn't offer much relief either. If you were fortunate enough to own shoes, they were made of untreated leather that softened too much in the rain and hardened like a rock otherwise. Tampering with size wasn't exactly an option, and there was zero arch support. In fact, your shoes, and this is if you could afford them, offered about as much arch support as a banana peel. Many peasants skipped shoes altogether, walking barefoot through mud, manure, and sharp debris strewn across medieval streets. Your feet were constantly battered, cold, and exposed. But again, this was just normal. No one questioned it because they had no alternatives. Modern shoes with cushioned soles and weatherproofing might as well have been sorcery. Now imagine working in these clothes. You're heading off to a field or workplace, trying to focus on your labour, but the constant itch distracts you at every turn. Your back itches under the layers of sweaty wool. Flea bites add little bursts of irritation on your arms and legs. And when the sun beats down on you during the day, sweat soaks into the fabric, only to harden into a stiff crust by the following morning. Add in the smells, stale sweat, body odour, dirt, and whatever your layer of grime picked up along the way, and you've got yourself a sensory experience no one asked for. It's little wonder that fresh clothes, or even freshly washed bodies, barely feature in medieval historical accounts. They simply weren't a part of everyday life. And while all of this seems intolerable from a modern perspective, it was normal back then. No one expected comfort or cleanliness from their clothes. Nobles, for all their extravagance, weren't any more comfortable. They just scratched their flea bites in more decorative fabrics. Peasants had no choice but to endure their homespun misery, because survival was the priority, not comfort or hygiene. Everything was about making resources last as long as possible, no matter the consequences for your skin, smell, or sanity. By the end of any given day, your clothes felt as worn out as you did. They were heavy with sweat, stiff with grime, and teeming with whatever insects had decided to hitch a ride. New clothes weren't on the horizon unless your current outfit literally disintegrated. And by then, you might not even notice the difference. Your wardrobe, and here the word wardrobe feels generous, wasn't just a collection of garments. It was a constant reminder of the discomfort and hardship that came with day-to-day survival in medieval England. So, yes, congratulations. You're dressed and ready for your medieval workday. But don't think the misery ends there. The itchiness and irritation follows you everywhere, from the field to the marketplace and back home again. And as exhausting as all this sounds, remember, you're not just working to make ends meet. You're working because if you don't eat. Comfort? Forget it. It's time to head into the back-breaking reality of medieval labour, because in a world where your clothes already make you miserable, work was about to do much worse.
Your workday starts at sunrise, that soft, golden hour when the modern world might brew a cup of coffee or scroll through emails. In medieval England, there was no such thing as easing into the morning. Your day began as soon as the first light crept over the fields, and it didn't end until the sun sank below the horizon, taking with it any hope of rest. 6 days out of every week were spent on a grueling treadmill of physical labor, and Sunday wasn't exactly a guaranteed break either. It might involve essential tasks like harvesting, or hours spent praying for rain, survival, or just a moment to breathe. And if you're imagining a future where all this work might finally pay off, forget it. Medieval life wasn't about promotions or progress. It was about enduring, because not working simply wasn't an option. Skipping even one day of work could cascade into disaster, dragging your family toward hunger faster than you could pull a plow through cold, stubborn earth. If you're a peasant, your workplace is the land itself. It doesn't matter if the weather is scorching, freezing, or somewhere uncomfortably in between. You're out there. Your tools aren't like the polished, ergonomic spades or plows you might see today. No, you're working with a wooden hoe, and maybe a rusty sickle if you're lucky. Functionality was as advanced as tools got. They were simple, but brutally effective at one thing: wearing out your body. And they had to last. Broken tools might mean weeks of saving, or bargaining, just to replace them. So, you would trudge out to the fields until soil that wasn't particularly kind, hoping you didn't strike a rock and splinter your only shovel. Ploughing was a central part of your day, and don't think it was as simple as walking behind an ox. First, you needed to have access to an ox. If not, congratulations, you just became the ox. You'll drag the primitive plough through the thick, unyielding dirt yourself. Your hands blister as you push forward, your legs burn from the effort, and sweat pours from your face well before the sun is even halfway through the sky. And even if you had oxen, those animals weren't immune to exhaustion, injuries, or illness. If they faltered, the job still needed doing, and you were the backup plan. But ploughing wasn't the only task waiting for you. There was soil to dig, seeds to plant, ditches to carve for irrigation, and endless weeds to pull. Every motion strained your back and exhausted your arms, but there was always something else that needed doing. Carrying water to keep your crops alive? That was your workout. Harvesting grain with your bare hands? Add it to the list. Every mere patch of earth was a battlefield, and most days, the land seemed to be winning. You weren't just farming. You were locked in combat with nature itself. The physical toll of this labor wasn't a matter of feeling sore. It wore people down in visible, permanent ways. By the time you're 30, which, in medieval terms, was well into midlife, your body looks and functions decades older. Constant bending and hauling caused bent backs and twisted joints. Calloused hands bored deep cracks that turned into infected sores. And there wasn't anything to help you recover. No balm, ice packs, or even an aspirin to dull the constant ache of overuse. You worked through the pain because stopping wasn't an option. If you're picturing this as some lone man with a plow scenario, think again. Women didn't get a pass. In addition to working the fields alongside their husbands or brothers, women managed the home in ways that went well beyond hanging laundry or baking bread. They cooked, cleaned, cared for children, spun wool, fed livestock, and hauled water from distant wells. These domestic tasks were as relentless as they were thankless. Even after a full day in the fields, there were still chores waiting at home. A woman's work wasn't over until she literally collapsed from exhaustion. And children? Starting at around age 5, they joined the labour force too. Their small hands were perfect for tasks like pulling weeds or chasing off birds that tried to snack on the scattered seeds. There wasn't any notion of protecting childhood or fostering development. Toys and playtime didn't exist, not unless you count rolling a dried up lump of animal dung across the grass as entertainment. Kids weren't students or dreamers. They were workers, expected to pull their weight just like everyone else. No rest for the weary or the young. Of course, farming wasn't the only way to scrape by. Maybe you worked as a blacksmith, hammering molten iron into tools or nails in a shed with no ventilation. The heat was suffocating. Burns and injuries were constant hazards. Or perhaps you were a tanner, boiling animal hides in vats of caustic chemicals, all while inhaling some of the foulest smells imaginable. Tanning was so unpleasant and so uniquely awful that tanners were often forced to live on the outskirts of towns, well away from the understandably offended noses of other people. Then there were the coopers, coopering away with wooden barrels, the millers, covered head to toe in flour dust, and countless other workers who laboured in filthy, dangerous conditions for wages that barely kept them alive. Whatever your job, it wasn't a career, it was survival. There were no pensions waiting on the other side of decades of service, just a slightly slower slide towards starvation. Speaking of starvation, let's talk about what happened when work didn't, well, work. Maybe a drought hits and reduces your crops to shriveled, useless husks. Or maybe a storm dumps an ocean's worth of water onto your field right before harvest, ruining everything. If your quota for the landowning lord wasn't met, the punishment wasn't just a stern talking to. It was, more often than not, starvation. That's right, the grain you harvested wasn't even completely yours. A large portion of what you grew went to the feudal lord, leaving you with barely enough to feed your family. In bad years, even that was in jeopardy. One bad season could spiral into months of hunger, intensifying every task you had to perform. And the job itself often robbed you of health. Hauling heavy loads ruined joints and caused hernias. Repetitive tasks wore down muscles and permanently weakened limbs. Cuts and scrapes were guaranteed, and without so much as a clean cloth to bind them, even the smallest injury could turn into a life-threatening infection. All that dirt you worked with got embedded in your skin, in your eyes, and deep into every wound. Living in constant motion, without rest, without adequate nutrition, took a toll on the body that's difficult to fully imagine. Yet, to every medieval worker, this wasn't hellish. It was just life. Breaks didn't exist outside of desperate pauses to catch your breath or choke down a bite of yesterday's stale bread. There wasn't a lunch hour. It was eat when you can or don't eat at all. As for leisure, forget it. By sunset, the light was gone, your body was breaking down, and you still had tools to clean or a hearth to tend before falling into bed. And then, somehow, you found yourself awake again, starting the same day all over. Even with all this work, survival wasn't guaranteed. Famine was a constant shadow looming over every household. Disease preyed on the weakened, underfed bodies of workers with cold efficiency. the relentless labor did not guarantee survival, and that was perhaps the cruelest part of it all. Even with the fields ploughed, the quotas met, and the animals fed, there was no security, no peace of mind. You worked in a world that was unforgiving, where one slip, one bad harvest, one bout of illness could send you into an irreversible spiral. So yes, your workday started at sunrise and didn't end until your body refused to go further. Exhaustion wasn't just expected, it was the default state. Work-life balance? There was no such thing. Life was work. Tomorrow promised more of the same, and every single day chipped further away at you in ways you couldn't fix or escape. It's grim enough to imagine, but here's where things take an even darker turn. After all that effort, time, and sweat, your reward was hardly safety or comfort. Instead, your endlessly tired body became even more vulnerable to disease, infection, and everything else that plagued medieval life. You could get through the workday, barely, only to find yourself laid low by something as simple as a fever or a scratch gone wrong. Let's not sugarcoat it. In medieval England, hard work might not kill you directly, but it sure wouldn't keep you alive for long. And this constant grind wasn't even the worst of it, because when sickness and injury did strike, the so-called medicine you turned to would often make things worse. Let's talk about that. You've worked yourself to the bone, but what happens when the real damage hits and you have nowhere to turn?
A simple scratch. That's all it took for your medieval nightmare to go from bad to worse. Whether it happened while hauling rocks in the fields or brushing against the wrong splintered door, the smallest wound could quickly spiral into something far, far deadlier. In medieval England, injury and illness weren't just inconvenient. They were a real gamble with your life. Medicine, if you could even call it that, was rooted in superstition, bizarre theories, and practices that often did more harm than good. Healing wasn't an expectation. Survival was a long shot. So, let's talk about the state of medicine during this period. Doctors believed the human body was controlled by the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Good health supposedly depended on keeping these humours in balance, and, as you'd expect, treating illnesses often involved some truly questionable logic. Feeling anxious or sad? That's an excess of black bile. The cure? Laxatives. Maybe an herbal purge to get things moving, or for some extra flair, a cold compress to the head while your family stood awkwardly nearby, already carving your coffin just in case. Any miraculous recovery had little to do with the treatment itself. If you somehow pulled through, everyone chalked it up to divine pity, and the doctor took credit for what was essentially luck. Let's not forget bloodletting. Ah yes, the go-to medieval cure for just about everything. Got a fever? Drain some blood. Persistent headache? Drain some more blood. Your local doctor, or barber, because yes, the guy trimming your neighbour's beard might also be slicing veins open with the same dull blade, would either attach leeches to your skin or use a small knife to bleed you out. The idea was to release the bad blood, restoring balance to your humours. The reality: you're now weaker, more anemic, and still very much sick, but congratulations, you've just paid someone to bleed you onto the floor. And keep in mind, none of these tools were sterilised. That blade used on you might have last been wiped on someone's apron after an entirely unrelated surgery, or not wiped at all. Speaking of surgery, let's set the scene. There's no anaesthesia unless passing out from sheer agony counts. No antibiotics to save you from the infection you're almost certainly about to get. And germ theory? Forget it. They thought illnesses were caused by bad smells, or maybe God being annoyed at your lack of moral fibre. Tools were heated over a fire, but not for sterilisation. No, they just wanted them to look intimidating. surgery wasn't about precision or minimizing damage. If something needed removing, whether it was a rotten tooth or a gangrenous limb, it was often a brutal hack and slash ordeal. The person wielding the blade likely had more experience cutting hair than navigating your body's anatomy. Imagine a barber surgeon with a hook in one hand and zero formal training reassuring you, "This will definitely help." And by help, they usually meant, "You've got a 50-50 chance of surviving this." Even something as small as a toothache could spell disaster. Tooth problems weren't treated with the care they are today. No numbing gel, no dental hygienists with soothing voices. Instead, if you couldn't endure the pain anymore, you'd head to the nearest barber surgeon, or maybe just that one guy in town who seemed to own the sharpest tools. They'd yank the problem tooth with iron tongs that might have been disinfected with, I don't know, a quick spit or a dip in ale. No anesthesia, no sterile gloves, just you biting down on a piece of wood and praying it would be over soon. And the real danger wasn't even the pain, it was the aftermath. Without proper hygiene or antibiotics, a simple tooth extraction could lead to sepsis, an infection that traveled through the blood and killed you slowly over the course of days or weeks. All this because your molar hurt. But what about illnesses that didn't involve wounds or broken bones? Well, things weren't any better there. Fevers, infections, digestive issues, all of them could go from manageable to fatal in the blink of an eye. Without antibiotics or vaccines, even relatively minor diseases hit like a freight train. Let's say you caught a fever. The best you could hope for was bed rest and a poultice made of crushed beetles or herbs that may or may not do anything. Doctors were less focused on actually curing you and more interested in managing symptoms, or more accurately, making you slightly less miserable before your inevitably grim outcome. And when death became inevitable, well, at least your family saved a few herbs they could use later. Now, hygiene, or lack of it, didn't exactly help. Let's remember, people weren't bathing regularly, their food was often spoiled, and their water sources seemed actively hostile to life. Contaminated water was widespread. Almost every river, well, and stream contained a brew of human waste, dead animals, and every disease-causing organism you could think of. Drinking it was a calculated risk, one that frequently did not pay off. Even if you stuck to beer, which was slightly safer, poor sanitation and food preparation could still take you out. Dining on rancid meat, mouldy bread, or pottage that had been simmering for far too long in a pot that never got cleaned wasn't just gross, it was dangerous. A bad meal could kill you, not with a blow to the head, but with days of severe stomach pain followed by, well, you know where this is heading. The lack of understanding around how diseases actually spread left medieval England relying on some truly wild theories. Maybe it was the air, bad smells caused sickness, right? Or maybe it was God punishing you for skipping Mass last week. Either way, actual solutions were non-existent because there was no concept of germs or bacteria. If someone had an infection, doctors rarely connected it to hygiene. Instead, they slapped on whatever concoction seemed vaguely medicinal and hoped for the best. And if you survived despite all odds, you were seen as borderline miraculous. Of course, nobody learned anything from your survival because the same ineffective treatments kept getting repeated on the next poor soul. But the real nightmare was how easily death lingered around every corner. You didn't need to fall off a ladder or catch the plague to be at risk. A piece of food lodged in your throat, a scrape that got slightly inflamed, an upset stomach, it all spiraled into the same grim possibility. You were constantly dodging death, not because you were careless, but because life itself was precarious. Illness had no boundaries. The peasant rolled up in filthy rags, and the noble wrapped in perfumed silks, both shared the same fragile fate. By now, you're probably thinking, Okay, at least we've advanced past this, right? That's true, but there's something uniquely horrifying about knowing that just a few hundred years ago, a scratch from a rusty nail or an overcooked meal could be the end of the line. Every moment of medieval life was a balancing act, trying to avoid injuries, bad food, and air that felt suspicious. And even if you played by all the rules, survived the cures, and lived longer than average, there was still no guarantee you'd escape the big one, a plague outbreak, wiping through your town like wildfire. So, here's the takeaway. Staying alive in medieval England was a daily fight against forces you couldn't control or understand. Medicine offered little relief, and life, despite all its toil and suffering, was breathtakingly fragile. But here's the thing. You've made it this far. You've endured the itch of bedbugs, the misery of communal latrines, the stink of unwashed wool, and the grind of endless work. And somehow, against all odds, you're still sitting up, scratching your head in disbelief. But don't get comfortable yet, because even sitting down to eat could bring its own dangers. Turns out, dodging illness was only part of the struggle. Now, you've got to make it through dinner without dying. Eating wasn't just routine in medieval England. It was risky business. Every bite of food came with a hidden question. Will this nourish me, or will it kill me? Let's start with the basics. Your food, no matter what it was, probably wasn't fresh by the time it hit your bowl or plate. There were no refrigerators, no vacuum-sealed packaging, and certainly no safety regulations keeping the rats and flies at bay. Everything you ate bore the scars of its journey. Mold creeping over bread, bugs scurrying in grain sacks, or meat that had started to smell just a little off. Food sat in conditions we'd call biohazards today. Back then, it was just Tuesday. Take bread, the staple of almost every medieval diet. For many, bread was life, literally the only thing that stood between them and starvation. But even this essential food wasn't always what it seemed. In years of poor harvest, stretching the grain supply became a dark art. Peasants would mix the flour with sawdust, bark, or even clay to eke out extra loaves. Imagine biting into what you were told was dinner, only to find it's more like chewing on old plasterboard. Nutritious wasn't the point. Filling your stomach was all that mattered. And then there was ergot, a fungus that thrived on rye in damp conditions. If you were unlucky enough to eat contaminated rye bread, you'd experience convulsions, hallucinations, or worse. People often thought they were cursed or possessed by demons, but really they'd just had one too many slices of ergot-infused toast. Your morning bread wasn't just food. It was a gamble with mental clarity, motor control, and occasionally your pulse. Vegetables weren't much better. Forget fresh produce at your local market. That wasn't a thing. In the summer, you might grow some leafy greens or root vegetables, but good luck finding those outside of harvest season. Vegetables were seasonal luxuries, and even when they were available, they weren't exactly coveted. Most people turned them into pottage, tossing whatever they had into the pot and letting it simmer for days, weeks even. The pot was never emptied, just topped off as needed. Leftovers were sort of eternal. While this may sound resourceful, it wasn't exactly hygienic. With each passing day, bacteria flourished in the stew, turning it into a culinary landmine. Sure, it might taste vaguely of onions or turnips, but beneath that was a host of microbes gearing up to send you straight to bed, possibly forever. And then there was the meat. Oh, the meat. If you're imagining succulent roasts or freshly cooked chicken, stop right there. For most peasants, meat was a rare treat, reserved for special occasions. Even then, special came with conditions. Without refrigeration, meat had to be eaten quickly, which wasn't always an option when you just slaughtered an animal big enough to feed a village. What didn't get eaten right away was salted, dried, or immersed in brine. These preservation methods weren't perfect. Salted meat could spoil if done improperly, and the smell alone might tell you the brine wasn't exactly slowing decay. Sometimes meat was left to hang for days, exposed to flies and other curious critters. By the time it was cooked, it was less of a delicacy and more of a formal meeting between you and food poisoning. You didn't enjoy it. You endured it, hoping it would stay down. Rats were another constant dining companion. They weren't just household visitors. They were avid participants in the supply chain. Grain silos and bread stores were hotbeds for rodent activity, and flattening the occasional rat carcass under your wheel of cheese wasn't out of the ordinary. Flies joined the party too, laying eggs on food left out in the open, turning your next meal into a buffet of maggots if you weren't paying attention. If you thought you could scrape the rot and vermin droppings off and call it a day, you'd be right, to a point. People did eat those leftovers, but every bite carried the risk of something worse than hunger. Dairy products, equally dicey. Milk spoiled within hours of being drawn, which meant it wasn't something you could keep on hand or enjoy fresh unless you happened to milk the cow yourself that morning. Butter and cheese had slightly better odds, but they were still far from safe. No one was pasteurizing anything. If bacteria moved into your dairy bowl, no one kicked it out. People still ate these foods, of course, because they didn't have a choice. When the alternative was going hungry, even spoiled milk might have seemed like a reasonable trade-off. And don't think spices could save the day. Sure, spices could mask bad flavors, but they weren't an option for ordinary folk. Pepper, cinnamon, and nutmeg were incredibly expensive, often worth more than gold. If you were a peasant, flavor enhancement wasn't in the cards. Your meals tasted like wet burlap sprinkled with sadness, and that's if the food wasn't spoiled. This lack of variety and seasoning made bland food even harder to stomach. But hey, at least you weren't eating boiled sawdust today. Small wins, right? Even hunting to escape this monotonous diet wasn't without risks. All game animals, deer, boar, rabbits, belonged to the landowner. Hunting them without permission was poaching, and punishment for it was severe. We're talking imprisonment, mutilation, or even execution in some cases. So while that rabbit in the meadow might have seemed tempting, just remember, it could cost you an ear, or your life. In a cruel twist, even the prey you relied on to survive could be the reason for your demise. Let's not forget the cumulative effects of all this. Poor nutrition, frequent foodborne illnesses, and a diet that lacked balance meant medieval people were constantly teetering on the edge of malnutrition. Their immune systems were weaker, their energy levels lower, and their ability to fight off infection practically non-existent. Life expectancy hovered somewhere around the mid-30s, but that wasn't just because of disease or work-related injuries. It was also because their bodies were slowly running out of fuel. On the rare occasions someone lived longer, they bore the marks of this diet in their weakened frames and prematurely aged faces. Now picture yourself sitting at a medieval table, ready to eat. You're staring at a bowl of pottage that's been warmed over for the past 2 weeks, trying to scoop out the least worst chunk of turnip, while ignoring the suspicious foam forming along the edges. On the side is a piece of bread so dense and dry that it might double as a construction material, served with a slab of salty, leathery meat that's giving off a questionable aroma. And let's say you're fortunate, or desperate, enough to still have a small wedge of cheese left over from the market. You know it's already turning green, but waste isn't an option. Bon appétit. Every meal you ate in medieval England wasn't just a struggle against hunger, it was a battle against the unseen enemies that lived on your plate. Flies, fungus, pests, bacteria. You weren't just dining, you were flirting with danger. Food poisoning was common, digestion wasn't guaranteed, and yet the alternative, starvation, left you with little choice but to pick up your spoon and hope for the best. What's sobering about medieval mealtimes is the sheer lack of control people had over their lives. You didn't choose your diet. Your options were dictated by the weather, the harvest, and the whims of a lord. If the harvest failed or a storm destroyed crops, there was no safety net, no backup plan. You went without. No amount of sawdust or brine could stretch what didn't exist in the first place. It makes you think twice about grabbing that quick snack from your pristine, fully stocked refrigerator, doesn't it? So every meal was a gamble. One small decision in a long series of daily risks that marked life in medieval England. And while you were fighting to stay fed, there was something else looming over your shoulder, watching your every move. No, not the rats this time. Something that controlled your life just as rigidly as your empty plate. What was it? The church. As if food poisoning wasn't enough, religion infused fear into every moment of existence, dictating what you could eat, what you could drink, how you lived, and even how you thought. Because in medieval England, dinner wasn't the only thing that could leave you shaken. And no, you didn't have a say in it either. Your day in medieval England wasn't just dictated by the rising sun or the demands of farming. It was dominated by the church. From dawn until dusk, and even as you slept, religion wove into every aspect of your life. There were no moments untouched by its influence. The church bells ringing through your village or town weren't simply marking the time. They were your schedule. Morning prayers, midday calls to reflect, evening vigils. Each sound was a reminder that salvation wasn't optional, and neither was obedience. The church controlled more than just your daily routine. It dictated the laws that governed your community, tying them tightly to religious rules. Sin wasn't just a spiritual concern, it had tangible consequences. Miss a prayer, that wasn't a no big deal situation, it was a sin. Legal trouble or social ostracism weren't far behind. The church's authority blended with secular power so seamlessly that even local lords upheld religious laws as if they were written in stone. And at the time, they might as well have been. And these weren't vague guidelines either. Priests preached vivid, stomach-churning images of hell to keep you in line. They described rivers of fire, lakes of boiling blood, demons with pitchforks, and eternal wailing, not as distant possibilities, but as real outcomes for anyone who strayed from the prescribed path. The message was clear. Sin carried a heavy price. You didn't just fear the punishments in this life, you feared what would come after. The church leaned into this fear, making sure you towed the line with every thought, word, and action. Conforming wasn't about preference, it was about survival. Even the calendar wasn't your own. The church dictated when you worked and when you didn't, carving your year into a string of holy days. But let's not confuse these holidays with the modern sense of the word. They weren't days for lounging around or relaxing. They were a chance to attend additional church services, confess your sins, fast, and maybe feel a little guiltier than usual. These holy days often reminded you that joy, if not outright sinful, was a slippery slope to indulgence. Celebration was something carefully monitored, lest it veer into something the church deemed inappropriate. Your life's biggest events, births, marriages, deaths, weren't just personal milestones, but moments overseen and choreographed by religious figures. Even those fleeting moments of respite were shadowed by obligations and rigid expectations. Education, too, was under the church's thumb. If you were lucky enough to learn to read, your reading material came from them. The Bible, written in Latin, was locked away from the average person's understanding, reserved for the monks, clergy, and the rare literate noble. You didn't interpret scripture. Priests did that for you and told you what it all meant. The church controlled access to knowledge, deciding which bits of it you were allowed to learn. Critical thinking wasn't encouraged. Questioning wasn't just discouraged, it was dangerous. The church's interpretation of the world around you wasn't up for debate. This monopoly on education kept people dependent on religious authorities for guidance, perpetuating their control over every facet of life. Money played a role in this control as well. Even if you weren't wealthy, you were required to pay tithes, a tenth of your possessions, to the church. If money was tight, maybe you handed over grain, livestock, or whatever else you could spare. It wasn't optional, and failing to give could mean being branded as spiritually bankrupt, or even cursed. The financial burden of these obligations reinforced the church's dominance, turning personal struggle into another avenue for institutional control. Not even poverty granted you freedom from this system. Instead, it compounded your difficulties, trapping you further under the church's authority. And while all of this weighed heavily on men, it came down even harder on women. The church's teachings placed strict limits on what women could do and the roles they could occupy. Women were expected to endure, obey, reproduce, and suffer in silence, ideally while smiling. If you were a nun, which often wasn't your choice to begin with, your life was tightly controlled by rules preventing you from even minor luxuries or freedoms. If you weren't, your worth was often seen through the lens of childbirth, domestic service, or how well you upheld the virtues of meekness and purity. The church's authority wasn't just spiritual, it reached into every aspect of who you were allowed to be. The fear of stepping out of line was ever present. Questioning the church's teachings, or, heaven forbid, the existence of God himself, wasn't simply an act of rebellion, it was heresy. And heresy had consequences. Heretics are burned, witches are drowned, blasphemers are flogged, and skeptics are quickly reformed. If those words sound harsh, imagine how much harsher it was to live under the looming reality of those punishments. Trials for witchcraft weren't the cozy credit scene of a Halloween special. They were grotesque, public affairs designed to scare everyone into submission. Just witnessing these events served as a chilling reminder of what could happen to anyone unwilling to accept the church's teachings at face value. And this wasn't limited to one town or one group of people. Whether you were a peasant or a noble, the church's grip was universal. Nobles might wield secular power, but they still bowed to religious authority. Priests and bishops wielded immense influence, controlling not just spiritual matters, but local politics, resources, and even military decisions. You might think being rich or powerful exempted you from constant religious scrutiny, but it didn't. The warnings about damnation weren't exclusive to the lower classes. They applied to everyone. And questioning the church's control wasn't a gamble the wealthy were willing to take either. Their privileges came with higher stakes and, often, harsher penalties for dissent. If all of this is starting to feel claustrophobic, it should. The pressure to conform wasn't just external, it crept into your thoughts. If you were even tempted to question the church, you carried the guilt and fear of that temptation everywhere. Could someone see your doubt in your face? Would your neighbor overhear something suspicious and report you? Guilt could turn into paranoia, and paranoia could turn into strict self-censorship. Living under the church's watchful eye meant you were constantly policing not only your behavior, but your private thoughts, your calendar, your marriage, your social interactions, your education, or lack of it. Everything was governed by religious expectations. Imagine that invisible weight. You're listening to the bells ring, reminding you again that prayer isn't just preferred. It's mandatory. You're fasting, not simply because there's no food left, but because it's the holy day of some saint and eating might earn you a scolding, or worse, eternal suffering. A simple misstep, like skipping confession or being seen working on a holy day, could mark you as defiant, a threat to the fragile order. To avoid this, you conformed. Everyone conformed. And so the church's power endured, perpetuated by a population too frightened or too powerless to question it. And this dominance wasn't passive, it was enforced. Think about how many aspects of medieval life came down to fear. Fear of sin, fear of damnation, fear of punishment, fear of hellfire. This was a society expertly built to ensure obedience, with your faith tied so intimately to your survival that separating the two felt impossible. The church controlled your calendar, your laws, your education, your birth, marriage, death, and everything in between, leaving little room for what we'd now consider personal freedom. There was no finding yourself or choosing your path. There was only God's plan, as interpreted by the same institution collecting your tithe and confining your thoughts. So, while the hardships of medieval life, the bugs in the bed, the spoiled food, the exhausting labor, were immediate and brutal, the spiritual weight of the church added another kind of burden. Even in the rare moments when your body might stop hurting, your mind never truly rested. The church wasn't just in your village or your home, it infiltrated your sense of self, shaping who you were allowed to be and what you were allowed to think. And yet, people endured. You've made it this far through medieval England, itchy, underfed, overworked, and now completely overseen by spiritual authority. At this point, you've scratched your way through crawling straw beds, unwashed clothes, and bowls of spoiled stew. You might expect there'd be some relief here, maybe even a bit of comfort in faith. But life didn't work that way, and survival came with no guarantees. What's left to face after all this? Well, sometimes the environment itself turns against you. You've survived God's watchful eye. Now you just have to survive everything else waiting around the corner. Think about everything you've heard so far. The beds alive with fleas, the water you couldn't drink, the relentless labor that broke bodies before their time. Life expectancy hovered around 30 to 40 years, and nearly half of all children didn't make it to age 5. It's sobering, isn't it? Yet, despite this harsh reality, people endured. They built, they dreamed, and they survived just long enough to move humanity forward. Now, take a moment to appreciate the soft bed you'll sleep in tonight, the clean water running in your tap, and the freedom to simply choose your path. We've come far. Let's never forget it.